The wind crawled low across the canyon like a dying prayer, dragging dust and cold through the brittle grass. Above it, the clouds hung swollen and heavy, pressing down on the broken ridgeline like an old promise about to snap. Rain had not yet come, but the air tasted of iron, and the sky pulsed with distant blue light, flickering like breath on the edge of death. Inside a weathered cabin of pine logs and nail-head shadows, Boone Calder sat alone, unmoving. His coffee, untouched, had long gone cold beside the fire. His hands, broad and leather-worn, rested on his knees. Calloused fingers curled slightly inward, like they were still gripping something long buried. In the half-light, Boone looked more like a carving than a man, something the land had forgotten, something time hadn't bothered to reclaim. On the mantel sat a faded photograph, a woman in a plain dress, strong shoulders and soft eyes. Sarah. Next to her stood a girl, no more than 8, with her mother's face and Boone's chin. Ellie. The picture was scorched on one corner, barely hanging together. Beneath the cottonwoods near the river bend, Boone had laid them both with his own hands. They died not in a war or plague, but in trust. Trusting the wrong riders. Men who smiled easy, wore clean boots and asked for water. Boone hadn't spoken a full sentence aloud since that morning. Not to another soul. Not to himself. He buried his words in the same ground that took Sarah and Ellie. The fire crackled faintly. He didn't feed it. Let it die, like all else. Outside, wind scratched the shutters. A loose board near the chimney creaked once. Then again, he didn't move, until it came. 3 sharp knocks at the door. He stayed seated, just listened. The wind, a falling branch. Coyotes don't knock. Then, a 4th knock, heavier, final, a rhythm like breath withheld too long. A knock that had waited 8 years to arrive. Boone's jaw clenched, his eyes shifted, slow, deliberate, to the front door. The fire snapped behind him, a single ember rising like a ghost whispering, "Do not forget." Some say the West was tamed by bullets and barbed wire. But sometimes, it's the quiet act of opening a door that splits a man's life clean in two. And this time, it wasn't death outside that waited. It was the start of something Boone hadn't dared believe in for a long, long while. Something still alive. The cabin was quiet now, but Boone Calder wasn't listening to the wind outside. He was listening to the ghosts. His hand rested on the old saddle, cracked leather, once oiled with care, now dusted with the years of not being touched. The saddle Ellie rode on her last day. He could still hear her voice echo across the clearing. "Papa, look, I ain't fallen off this time." That laugh, God help him, he'd give a bullet to the heart just to hear it again. The memory came like a storm. Not the kind that breaks the sky. The kind that steals your breath slow. 2 weeks before the fire. The valley was green then. The creek sang through the rocks. Boone had taken the day off ranch work to teach Ellie to ride full gallop. She was only 7, but she was fearless like her mama. Sarah stood on the porch with a hand on her hip and a smile behind her eyes. "You better not let her fall, Boone Calder," she'd said. Boone chuckled. "You doubting my judgment, Mrs. Calder?" "Number, I'm doubting your coordination." He lifted Ellie into the saddle and she giggled, reins in her tiny hands. "Papa, I want to ride like a Comanche." Boone had smiled wide. "Then you better ride light and hold fast." She did. She flew across the field like a flame, dress whipping in the wind, hair trailing behind like wildfire. Sarah had watched with tears at the corners of her eyes. "That girl's got wings." Boone had reached for her hand and squeezed it. "She's got you." That night, they had dinner by the fire, beans, cornbread, and Sarah's blackberry preserves. The house smelled of cedar and love and wood smoke. Boone had strummed his guitar, badly, but it made Ellie laugh. "More, Papa," and he had played more. Sarah leaned on his shoulder. "You ever think we'd find this?" He had kissed her hair. Every day. But memory never ends with the sweet. It ends with the wrong knock at the door. That night, thunder in the distance, Ellie asleep by the fire, Sarah buttoning the front of her blouse. Boone heard hooves, 3, maybe 4, men unannounced riding heavy. He reached for the rifle above the mantel. "Boone?" Sarah had asked. "Stay inside," he'd said. "Keep Ellie behind the bed." The men were strangers. One wore a Union jacket with the insignia torn off. Another had eyes that darted like snakes. They asked about land rights. They asked about Apache sightings. They asked about Sarah. Boone had lied. "No one's passed here in weeks." But his hands were too tight on the gun. They saw it. The smallest man had whispered something, and one chuckled. "I hear your wife's a healer," he said. "Got special hands for wounds. Maybe she can help us." Boone raised the rifle, and they left. But not far. He watched them from the hill that night, lanterns flickering in the woods, waiting, watching. 3 days later, the fire started while Boone was in town for supplies. By the time he returned, he never said the rest out loud. Now, 8 years later, with strangers once again knocking in the dark, Boone stood in the same doorway, hand trembling over the same iron bar. But this time, the wind didn't just carry fear, it carried a whisper, Sarah's voice. "Kindness is what separates us from the beasts." He lowered his hand, listened again to the women's voices outside, not soldiers, not bandits, pleading. His hand moved to the latch, and in his heart, the saddle creaked again under the weight of Ellie's laughter. Would you have opened the door if you were Boone, knowing what happened the last time you trusted strangers? Type yes if you'd still choose kindness. Type no if fear would have closed the door. The space between Boone's hand and the latch felt like a mile of desert stretched across years. He stood motionless, breath shallow, eyes locked on the door like it might open on its own and bring back every damn thing he buried. The grain of the wood shimmered in the firelight, scarred and split from decades of weather, fists, and winter. Each line held a memory, each knot an unspoken choice. He clenched his fist, released it. Then he moved. The iron bar scraped as he slid it free. A groan echoed through the room, like the cabin itself wasn't sure this was the right thing to do. Boone took one slow breath and pulled. The door creaked open, not wide, just enough to let in the storm. But what stepped into view wasn't thunder or lightning. It was 10 women soaked in rain, skirts caked with mud and blood, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. And yet, not a single one of them looked broken. At the front stood one with a split lip and black hair braided tight against her skull. She stared at him like a cliff faces down a flood. Boone would learn her name later. Luma. To her left, a younger woman clutched a wrapped bundle against her chest. The child inside let out a soft, wet cough. She was barely older than Ellie would have been now. Boone's throat closed like a gate. That was Rena. They didn't speak. They didn't plead. They just waited. Boone's eyes flicked over their faces, searching for threat, for a sign this was a trick. But what he saw instead hit harder than any bullet. They had already been through war. He stepped back, no words, just space. They entered slowly, deliberately, like spirits crossing into firelight. One by one, dripping and watchful. The smell of wet wool and open wounds followed them in. Boots thudded onto his floors. Shawls left puddles on pine. Blood stained his world once more. Rena was last. Her eyes caught his. They didn't ask for permission, just a silent challenge. You going to make us human again, or close that door forever? She passed, the baby barely moving in her arms. Boone shut the door behind her. The latch fell into place with a sound that felt final. Not like a prison, but like a beginning he hadn't asked for. Across the room, Galloway stood. The mute blacksmith hadn't spoken since Boone found him half dead years ago. But he gave Boone a look now, not a question, a warning. Boone didn't answer. He turned back to the fire, but it no longer offered comfort. Behind him were 10 women, 10 lives, 10 storms. And the fire had just been relit. If you were Boone, would you have opened the door? Type yes if you would have let them in. Type no if you'd have left the past where it belonged. The sun had not risen over Fort Camden the morning Luma made the decision to run. But smoke had. It rose in thick black plumes from the longhouse where the men had been held, where her husband, her uncle, her eldest son were shackled 2 days before. Now the building was ash and twisted bones. Luma didn't wait for answers. She didn't wait for prayers. She gathered the women, 10 of them, the old, the young, the broken. She woke Rena first, barely 19, her eyes still red from yesterday's lashes, her newborn baby still nameless. They killed the men, Luma said. We leave now. Rena didn't ask how. She wrapped her child in a woven cloth, kissed the tiny forehead, and nodded. Others followed. Nolly, whose husband had been shot while harvesting corn. Tala, the midwife. Sona, who had not spoken a word since the raids began. And 3 girls who had never held a weapon, but carried the grief of generations. They moved under cover of the ash and early fog, slipping past soldiers drunk on blood and whiskey. Fort Camden had once been a place of trade and treaty. Now it was a pit of sorrow. The guards did not chase. Why would they? What threat were 10 hungry women with bare feet and children in arms? They underestimated them. They always did. Day 1. They traveled east, always east, toward the highland where river forks and soldiers dared not follow without guides. But the ground was soaked. Rain from 2 nights past had turned the trails into clay. Rena stumbled often. The baby whimpered, not from hunger. He had stopped crying days ago, but from breath so faint even death seemed afraid to claim him. They ate what little they had, dried corn, root bark, cactus hearts. Luma refused to stop more than a few hours at a time. The farther they got, the harder they were to track. But with each mile, the fear grew louder in their silence. Day 2. Tala collapsed near a boulder shaped like a horse's head. Her feet were split, bleeding through the wrappings. She begged them to leave her behind. Luma carried her for 3 miles. When she could carry no more, she cut a sapling, made a drag harness, and pulled Tala through the river shallows. I will not leave anyone, she said to no one in particular. I buried enough. Day 3. Rain again, the kind that slices sideways, cold and angry. One of the girls, Naya, was swept down a ravine crossing a stream. Luma leapt after her without hesitation. They both came out shivering, bruised, but alive. That night, they found an abandoned hunting shack, 2 walls and part of a roof. They huddled together, 8 bodies wrapped around 1 infant. Rena stared at the flame, eyes unblinking. He won't make it through another storm. Luma didn't argue. She simply rose, stepped out into the wind, and stood on the hill. She had heard stories, whispered over cook fires, and passed from grandmothers to daughters, about a rancher who lived alone, who never spoke to anyone, but who had once fought beside their people during the Canyon War. His name was lost, but his location? It was here, somewhere beyond the tree line, a cabin with a stone chimney and smoke. Dawn, the decision. Luma looked back at her sisters, Rena, asleep with the baby clutched tight, Tala snoring softly, the girl with the limp murmuring in her dreams. She knew they could not run forever, that the men who burned Fort Camden were still behind them, Captain Slate's men. The same captain who once smiled during peace talks, but wore the scalps of her kin beneath his saddle flap. They would catch up. But maybe, just maybe, a door would open before they did. Dusk, the cabin. They saw the smoke first, thin and steady, not from war, from habit. Luma pulled Rena close. "We try once." "And if he won't help us?" Rena asked. Luma touched her knife. "Then we take his horse and run until the earth swallows us." But in her heart, she didn't want to steal. She wanted hope. And so they walked through the final veil of trees. 10 women, a baby. A storm at their back. And a prayer in their chest. They reached the porch. And Luma knocked. Boone stood alone beneath the open sky, the deed in one hand, Sarah's key in the other. The wind had shifted again, drier now, but still whispering like it knew things he didn't. Behind the cabin, the shed loomed under the cottonwoods, a squat shape of rusted hinges and peeling paint. He hadn't laid eyes on it in 8 years. He hadn't wanted to. Now it stared back like a mirror he'd spent too long avoiding. Back inside, the cabin was quiet, tense. The women were tending wounds, reshaping the room with movement. Boone wasn't used to, soft, efficient, without apology. They were survivors, not guests. And somehow that made their presence feel heavier. Boone lit a kerosene lantern and walked toward the shed. The path was overgrown. A thistle tore through his pant leg, but he didn't slow. At the door, he hesitated. The key was cold in his fingers, not because of the weather, but because it felt like betrayal. Still, he slid it into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door creaked open. Dust bloomed like smoke. The scent of old soil, wood oil, lavender, and thyme hit him like a punch. Inside, shelves lined with labeled jars, empty seed pouches, leather-bound notebooks, maps rolled into cracked tubes. And in the corner, a metal lockbox, small, dented, and heavy with silence. He carried it inside, placed it on the table. Luma and Rena stood nearby, eyes steady, saying nothing. Boone opened it. Inside were letters, one addressed to him, one to Ellie, and one unopened, marked only with a strange symbol, Apache script. Luma's breath caught. She recognized it, a tribal mark, a family crest. Boone picked up Sarah's letter, unfolded it with hands that had once held her hair, her face, her heartbeat. "Boone, if you're reading this, then everything I feared has happened. I never stopped loving you, but I stopped trusting that the world would leave us alone. There were things I learned, things I couldn't tell you without putting you in danger. This land, it hides more than bones." Boone stopped reading. He didn't need the rest, not yet. Outside, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from the ridge. Hoofbeats, dozens. Boone stepped outside and scanned the distant hills. The storm hadn't come from the clouds. It had come on horses. He returned to the cabin, loaded shells into the shotgun. Each one slid in like punctuation. Not revenge, not rage, resolve. He handed the lockbox to Luma. "I think this is yours as much as mine now." Then he turned to Rena, nodded toward the baby. "Get low. Stay ready." Galloway stood at the window, silent as ever, but his grip on the hammer had changed. From behind him, Boone whispered a line only the wind heard. "The West don't give second chances, but sometimes it gives you just enough rope to pull someone else out." The canvas flap of the officer's tent snapped in the wind like a warning no one had listened to. Inside, Captain Arlen Slate stood alone, face lit only by the flicker of a lantern swaying from the center post. His boots were still caked with ash from Fort Camden. His gloves, speckled with dried blood, lay forgotten on the table. He poured himself a drink. Not whiskey. Room. It reminded him of the islands. The first place he learned how to make men obey. Not with speeches, but with fear. Across from him, a young Apache man knelt, hands bound, one eye swollen shut, lips bloodied but silent. He hadn't spoken since they dragged him out of the brush. Slate squatted to his level. "You know, back in Baton Rouge," Slate began, "we used to teach horses with fire. Brand 'em first, then they listen better." He took a sip, let it burn slow down his throat. "But I don't need you to talk. I already know where they're headed." He stood, motioned to the two soldiers outside. "Take him out. Hang him where the road forks. I want that old rancher to see what loyalty buys these days." The prisoner didn't flinch. Slate almost admired it. Almost. Outside, rain fell soft like regret, but there was no regret in Slate. He stepped into the open, face turned toward the hills. Somewhere out there, 10 Apache women were fleeing with something more dangerous than weapons: testimony, truth, and that made them more lethal than any bullet. Flashback. Why Slate hates this land. It wasn't just the Apache he wanted erased. It was the shame. 10 years ago, this same region had stripped him of rank during the treaty reconciliation, when he hesitated to burn a peaceful camp. That hesitation cost him favor. He swore he'd never hesitate again. When Morrison fell, Slate saw the writing on the wall. Washington wanted stories tied up, buried, but he didn't care for politics. He wanted silence. Final, unquestioned silence. And Boone Calder? That name had once crossed his desk during the war. A man who walked away from blood. A man who now stood between him and erasure. Scene: rallying the men. By dawn, Slate stood before 24 soldiers, tired, mud-smeared, but loyal. That cabin ain't a home. It's a nest of vipers. Some hesitated. A sergeant even murmured, "Sir, there's a child. We heard crying." Slate cut him off cold. Crying won't stop a bullet, and traitors with babies are still traitors. He raised his voice. "Any man who questions the order can ride east tonight and tell the brass he tucked tail." No one moved. "Good," he said. "Then we finish this. No more running. No more women slipping through cracks. This ends with Ash, and Ash don't talk. Reveal the boy." As the soldiers dispersed, Slate stepped into a second tent. There, sitting quiet in the corner, was a pale, thin boy of about 15, his own son Jude. He wasn't dressed for battle. He wasn't even carrying a weapon. "You're riding with us," Slate said. Jude looked up slowly. "Why?" "Because one day, command will be yours. And I want you to learn what real men do when law gets soft." The boy didn't answer. His hands clenched, his shoulders curled inward like he was trying to become smaller than the silence around him. Slate grabbed him by the chin. "Don't look away. This is legacy." Jude blinked. Slate let go and walked out. But he didn't see the boy slip a folded letter into his jacket. Didn't notice the hesitation behind the silence. And didn't know that inside that folded page were the last words of Sarah Calder, given to Jude by a passing traitor 3 days earlier. Slate had planned for every variable, except for conscience. The sky broke open before the storm did. The stars vanished, swallowed by a slate-colored curtain. The land went quiet, so quiet it felt unnatural, like even the coyotes had paused to listen. Inside the cabin, Boone sat on the edge of the table, loading the final shells into the double barrel, each click a heartbeat. The others moved with quiet purpose. Luma wiped her blade with the hem of her dress. Rena secured the baby in a woven sling, wrapping it tighter to her chest. Tala handed out strips of rawhide, makeshift bandoliers, belts, straps for wounds not yet opened. Even Galloway, who had barely blinked since sundown, now moved with intent, stacking chairs near windows, hammering shut the final loose board. His silence, like Boone's, wasn't emptiness, it was a vow. The boy, Jude now, not Slate Jr., sat by the door with his back straight, his father's revolver in his lap. The same weapon he had nearly died by. His thumb rolled the cylinder in rhythm, eyes distant but not vacant. Boone stepped onto the porch. The air tasted of iron. Then it came. Hoofbeats, measured, dozens of them, like a slow drum roll rising from the ridge. A lantern flared in the dark, casting silhouettes of men on horseback, long, lean shadows stretching across the earth like the arms of judgment itself. And then, his voice. Boone called her, Captain Vern Slate. No longer a rumor, no longer a threat whispered through letters and blood. You've got what don't belong to you. Hand over the women and the boy, or I burn it all down. Boone didn't answer. He took one step forward and cocked the shotgun. Slate laughed. Still playing cowboy, Calder? You couldn't even protect your own. That was the wound Slate knew to strike. And he did, without flinching. I read your wife's letter, he said, louder now. She begged me to spare her, offered me this land in trade, said you'd never use it, that you were too soft for the West. Inside the cabin, Boone's spine locked straight. That wasn't true. Couldn't be. But Slate kept talking. She even offered me your daughter. Crack. A shot rang out, not from Boone, not from the ridge, but from behind the tree line. One of Slate's riders tumbled from his horse, screaming. Then another shot. Then chaos. From the brush, shadows emerged, riders with Apache paint, rifles drawn. Not many, but enough. Luma's people, not ghosts, survivors. She looked at Boone and whispered, almost smiling. We weren't the only ones she warned. Inside the cabin, Galloway let out a breath, a sound Boone hadn't heard in years. Not words, just relief. Then came the rush. Gunfire cracked through the dark. Boone dropped the first man that approached the porch. Luma threw her blade with perfect weight, catching another soldier just before he reached the window. Rena pressed herself against the wall, baby cradled, eyes wide, but unshaken. Slate charged forward like a bull without reins. Saber, raised, hate in his bones. Boone met him at the stairs. They clashed, steel and wood, flesh and memory. Every swing brought with it a face. Sarah, Ellie, the boy standing behind him now, trembling but holding his ground. Slate roared and raised his saber again. A gunshot stopped him mid-step. Not Boone. Jude. His hands shook. His breath caught, but the barrel still smoked. Slate staggered, blade slipping from his grip. He dropped to his knees. This time Boone didn't move. This wasn't his kill. This was judgment, delivered by blood. And finally, silence returned. But it wasn't peace. Not yet. Would you trust Luma's allies to join the fight, even when hope seems lost? Type yes if you'd stand beside them. Type no if you'd rather face it alone. The smoke hadn't cleared, but the killing had stopped. The air hung heavy with the scent of gunpowder, wet earth, and the bitter truth that nothing would be the same again. Boone stood over the broken porch rail, chest heaving, shotgun lowered but still clutched like a final word. Blood dripped slowly from a cut above his brow. Not deep, just enough to sting. Around him, the night was littered with bodies, some still, some moaning, some gone before they hit the ground. Galloway leaned against the doorframe, bruised, bloodied, hammer still in hand. His silence had become sacred now. No words needed. He had done what he stayed alive for. Inside, the baby cried, not in pain, but from the echo of chaos. Rena cradled the child tighter, whispering in soft Apache, rocking not just the infant, but herself. Boone turned and met Jude's eyes. The boy hadn't moved since the shot. His father lay face down near the front steps, saber still in hand. Jude stared at him, hollow, the revolver slack at his side. I didn't want to, he whispered. Boone stepped closer. I know. The boy looked up. But he would have killed you. Boone nodded. And everyone else. Jude blinked, once, then twice, then broke. The sob came low, like something torn from his ribs. Boone placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, held it there. No words, just weight, shared and solid. In the back of the cabin, Luma emerged limping. Her blade gone, but her posture still unyielding. Her eyes scanned the field and stopped on one of the Apache riders who joined the fight. Her younger brother, barely more than a shadow behind a rifle. They nodded to each other. No embrace, no tears. Just that look, the one only survivors share. Boone stepped back inside, picked up the letter Sarah had written to Ellie. He hadn't opened it. He still didn't. Instead, he placed it in a leather pouch and tucked it into the baby's sling across Rena's chest. "She should read it when she's old enough," he said. Rena looked at him with something close to disbelief. "Are you sure?" Boone looked around, at the shattered furniture, the burned edges of his life, the blood on the floor that would never quite wash out. "Nothing here belongs to me anymore," he said. Maybe it never did. The cabin creaked in the wind. Luma stepped forward, her voice soft but resolute. "There's land north of the Rio Bravo. We can start again." Boone shook his head. "You will." "And you?" He glanced at the saddle in the corner, the one he hadn't used in years, the one Ellie used to polish when she was still learning how to ride. "I'll take them to the crossing, make sure Rena and the baby get safe passage to her kin, then maybe head west, build fences, fix things that need fixing." Luma gave him a long look. Boone held it. No words passed, but something did. Respect, maybe more. The sun cracked the horizon like an old promise kept. Light spilled slow across the high desert, turning the broken ground gold, the blood dark, and the smoke into soft ribbons that rose toward a kinder sky. Boone stood alone on the ridge above the cabin, his coat flapping gently in the morning wind. Below, what was once his sanctuary looked like the remnants of a war, a place where fire and fear had tried to take root but hadn't quite succeeded. Behind him, a trail wound toward the north, already faint beneath the boots and hooves of those who had chosen to live. Luma and her brother had taken the women homeward, into a land uncertain but free. Rena had left earlier, baby in her arms, riding behind Galloway on a borrowed mule. She didn't cry, she didn't wave, but she had turned once, just once, and offered Boone a look that said everything words couldn't. Boone remained. He watched the wind sweep across the scorched field, rustling the wild sage, nudging ash and spent cartridges into silence. In one hand, he held Sarah's final letter, still unopened. In the other, a weathered saddlebag filled with seed packets, maps, and a tattered photo of Ellie. He whispered to no one, "You were right, Sarah. Kindness is the last thing that separates us from the beasts." The sound of hooves broke the stillness. A rider approached from the east. Federal Marshal. Uniform clean, eyes tired. News had traveled fast. Investigators were en route. There'd be questions, reports, maybe trials. The marshal nodded to Boone. "You Boone Calder?" Boone nodded. The man dismounted, removed his hat. "Heard what happened. Folks are saying you held off a death squad with nothing but grit and ghosts." Boone didn't answer. "Is it true? That boy, Jude, he really slates blood?" Boone looked toward the rising sun. "Blood don't mean a damn thing out here. What you choose, that's what counts." The marshal gave a respectful nod, then offered a folded piece of paper. "They're giving you a pardon. Military's backing off. Government wants to bury it all, quietly." Boone didn't take it. Instead, he handed the marshal Sarah's unopened letter. "Make sure this finds its way to Denver. There's a child there who'll need to know who her mother was." The marshal studied him. "You sure you don't want to read it?" Boone turned back to the edge of the ridge. "I already did. In the way she lived. In the people she saved." The marshal left. Boone saddled his horse. No destination, no trail to follow. But something inside him had shifted. Not healed. Healing don't come easy out here. But stirred. And as the wind carried voices only the desert could hear, Boone spoke once more. Some men ride west looking for fortune. Some ride west looking for peace. Me? I ride west to remember. So I never forget what's worth dying for. 3 lessons from the dust and blood. Kindness is a form of courage. Boone let strangers into his home not because he had to, but because something deeper than grief stirred. A memory of what it meant to be human, even when the world tells you to shut the door. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who walks forward because of you. Sarah's choices lived on through Luma, Rena, and even Jude. Her story became a map, not a memory. Redemption doesn't require perfection, only a decision to do the next right thing. Boone wasn't a hero. He was a man who said yes when it counted, and that made all the difference. Which lesson struck you the most? Type 1, 2, or 3 below and tell us why. And remember, out here on the Cowboy Trail, every ending is just another campfire waiting to be lit. Desert fire.